Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome you to our press conference here at the LOB building at the New Hampshire State House. It's beautiful November 10th, one day before Veterans Day, 2015. My name is Hal Sherliff. I am the coordinator for the John Birch Society in New England and upstate New York. And I'm very pleased to introduce Duke Pastor. Before I do, I just want to mention a few things. Earlier today, I guess it's actually still going on, some educational people in New Hampshire invited Mr. Marc Tucker to speak. And Marc Tucker is well known in these, what we call the educational elite circles. In 1995 in December, our late friend Sam Blumenfeld wrote a newsletter about Mr. Tucker in his 18-page letter that he sent to Hillary Clinton. I'm sure they probably had a nice little reunion yesterday when Hillary was here signing her election material. So we made this available at the meeting, and we passed a lot of these out. I have some other copies if you like. Please take it. It is our PDF, and you can find a lot of material about this 18-page letter where he's gushing over the election of Bill and all the great things they're going to accomplish and how they're going to advance their international global agenda and so forth and so on. I want to point out, too, some of the material we have available from our New American magazine. There's a couple of articles on the subject of Common Core. And one of the things I point out is the data mining aspect of Common Core and some of the nasty things that they wouldn't be able to do. If you got arrested, you wouldn't be able to ask you these kinds of questions, but they're asking our children these kinds of questions in public schools around the country. And Dr. Pester has given over 400 presentations in 40 states, I think. 40 states? We're going to try to get him up to Maine pretty soon. And this was a presentation he gave, I think it was last year, in Albany, New York. So I have some of these available for you as well. He's all over the YouTube. So you just put in Duke Pester YouTube, and there's probably about 500 videos, and probably 4 or 5 over the last couple of days. Dr. Pester is a professor of English at the University of Oshkosh in Wisconsin. He's a Shakespeare scholar, and I'm kidding. I said he actually believes Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's, but we had to indulge that little oversight there. He's the academic director of Freedom Project Education, which is an arm of the John Birch Society. It's an online degrees granting entity. And he's become a good friend of mine, and we're delighted to have him up here in New Hampshire. And actually, it was Anne-Marie Banfield that put me aware of Marc Tucker and her article in her blog. And she said, why can't we get Sandra Stotsky, or why don't they bring up Duke Pester? I said, hey, he's going to be with me today, and so let's make it happen. So with that, we want to thank you. Let's give
what a coincidence.
I'm very grateful for a chance to be back at the State House. We were here last year with Hal, and we've got a lot more people here today. This was very, I think, divinely inspired. It was completely an accident that I happened to be in the New Hampshire area at the same time Mr. Tucker was invited to address the legislature. And I think what this comes down to, this is an important codicil we have to make. Ever since the creation of the Department of Education in the late 1970s, a huge, expensive federal bureaucracy whose sole purpose was not to improve the quality of education in the country, but to justify its own existence. We see this with all huge federal bureaucracies. Whatever they're created to do, eventually they become fiefdoms of huge influxes of cash, our taxpayer dollars. And that goes to protecting. You know, the Department of Education has its own SWAT team. Never been used, but a hugely expensive SWAT team that the Department of Education has for no real purpose. And so you see how these bureaucracies become corrupted. This comes down to an attitude. How are we going to educate our kids? For 50 years, we've taken the model, the argument, that the best and only way to educate our kids is to centralize control of education, to cede more power for control to the federal government, and then to exercise these shockingly large, nationalized, standardized tests. You understand that if you're giving 60 million American school kids the same test, that test cannot tell a working teacher in a working classroom a single meaningful thing about the kids that she teaches. All that these tests do is provide huge aggregate data for pencil pushers at the Department of Education. They're meaningless. Well, I shouldn't say that they're meaningless. They're meaningless in terms of teacher aides. The entire Common Core system, as we had with No Child Left Behind, the entire Common Core system is measured exclusively on these great big national standardized tests. They don't tell teachers anything meaningful. They're about collecting of aggregate data, but they're incredibly stressful on kids. They're incredibly intrusive on classroom teaching. You all remember, people of a certain generation, we remember that the only tests we ever took in school were the Iowa Basics. 2 days in March and the whole testing was done. We didn't do anything to have to prepare for those tests. We took them, we were done with them. And those tests They genuinely sought to measure baseline achievement in a really modest way. These tests measure none of that stuff. And so these tests are the mechanism of control whereby teachers now are compelled to teach the tests. We have the actual architect of Common Core, David Coleman, on film saying, quote, "There is no force on this planet strong enough to stop your teachers from teaching to our tests." There's a reason why things like No Child Left Behind and now Common Core have really marginalized support. In my lifetime, I have never seen an issue that had such support from the radical left and the right as well. Groups like the BATs, the Badass Teachers Association, a progressive organization of about 150,000 left-wing teachers, has stood arm in arm with Tea Party activists on the other side to protest this. For a number of, why? Why are major progressive teachers unions in places like New York City and Chicago, Illinois, why are they radically fighting Common Core? Because they recognize that it's not just bad for kids. All of this developmentally inappropriate testing, all of this untried pedagogy in things like math, that abstract math for little kids to the point that they can't developmentally understand it. All of these problems that come along with the core, they're even bigger for teachers. You're teachers now, and I want to make an appeal to you here. This is not specifically about Common Core, this debate. If you get rid of Common Core tomorrow, you're still going to have these problems. Too much centralization, too much federalization, too much testing. You know, America became a superpower on the backs of men and women who learned in one-room schoolhouses. How did that happen? Common sense tells us that the most effective form of education that's ever been practiced, you need three things. You need a disciplined child, you need a committed parent, and you need an effective teacher. If you have those three things, you can educate. That's why the single-room schoolhouse model worked. Remember, in a lot of those one-room schoolhouses, you had third graders and seventh graders and ninth graders all learning from the same teacher on the same day at the same time. Why did it work? Because the teacher understood the kids in front of her. The teacher knew their backgrounds and knew their strengths and weaknesses and got to know them over a number of years. She could address those kids where they were. And on top of that, those kids were disciplined. They were yes ma'am, no sir kids. They were kids with religious convictions. They were kids who were there to learn. They weren't distracted and they weren't disrespectful. You've watched the videos from across the country now of principals being body slammed by students, of teachers being threatened to be hit with desks in classrooms. Kids so disruptive in class that teachers can't stop them, that principals can't stop them, that police officers have to be invited into the classroom. And when the police officers cannot get the kids to relent and drag them out of their chairs to arrest them, the cops are promptly fired. You can't have education in a system where there is no discipline. You got three things that work. So you got disciplined children. Do we have kids in this country that if our parents recognize that they're not doing well in their schoolwork, are we willing to pull our kids out of football practice? Take them off the cheerleader squad? Take the technology and the laptops out of their hands? Are we, as parents, disciplined enough? We all remember when we were kids. When we went home from school with a note from the teacher, it didn't really even matter. We were in trouble. The teachers were backed up by the parents. Issues of discipline and learning were entrusted to teachers, and parents supported them. And you had a real system there. You had committed parents, you had disciplined kids, and that allowed teachers to be effective. Up until about the creation of the Department of Education, certainly in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, the control of standards was with the teachers in the classroom. And this argument that you hear from Common Core advocates, that if you don't want Common Core, you just don't want standards, is absurd. Whenever you have a teacher giving tests and grading quizzes, you have a standard. And guess what? It's a standard that's measurable. It's a standard that's impactful. Because if all of the kids but 3 are learning the math or getting the reading, then you can intervene in a much more meaningful way. And then you have a mechanism to figure out why. Well, I know why those 3 kids aren't learning. They've missed half the semester. They're not paying attention. You can do something. How do you come up with any of this stuff with a system as broad as one test for 60 million American kids? It's not possible. This idea that we have to go back to this. In the 50s, 40s, 30s, the teacher set the standard. Not even the school. The teacher set the standard. And she had real power because the parents helped her. And the kids were there to learn. That's gone now. In the 80s, late 1970s, we bumped all the standards up to the district level and weakened everything. Then in the 90s and the early 2000s, we bumped it up to the state level, was in control of everything. And then with things like Goals 2000, things that Mr. Tucker had a large say in, things like Goals 2000 and No Child Left Behind, all of that got bumped up to the national level. Do we honestly believe now that if that's what works, parent, teacher, and kid, it's always worked. What you are now at Common Core, you are as far removed from that kind of local control as you could possibly be unless the United Nations were to take over education. And don't think that is such a ridiculous proposition. People fail to recognize that Bill Gates himself in the early 2000s, he, as a private citizen, signed a private contract to work with the United Nations, to work with UNESCO, to bring some kind of universal educational paradigm to the United States and beyond. Bill Gates, of course, is the prime non-federal funder of Common Core. And I ask you this question. What qualifies Mr. Gates to be involved in transforming your schools? He has no educational background. I've made this argument before, right? People never ask that question. What entitles Bill Gates, who has no elected office, who you as moms and dads, the primary stakeholders of public education, and that's the last time I'm going to call it public education. Because it's not public education anymore. Public education means that you, the moms and dads, are in charge of it. You have a say. They should have asked you before they did this. They didn't. I'm going to start calling this what it is. These are government schools now, where the objective of things like Common Core is to freeze you out of it. How many of you have gone to your schools to try to talk to school administrators about Common Core, which you didn't ask for, which you weren't consulted about, and how they brush you off, right? Your input isn't welcome. How about what Hillary Clinton said? In April of this year on film, on a campaign stop, she said, when she was asked about Common Core, Hillary Clinton said, when I think about all the controversy over the new Common Core standards, it's painful, she said. It's depressing. How did we become so cynical about the single most important non-family issue facing our kids, which is education? In April of 2015, Hillary Clinton said that education is a non-family issue. It is not your choice. It is not your prerogative. You don't have a say in it. Mainstream candidate for the Democrats. Republicans have been no better on this issue either. But we've bumped it up, right? We've gone from a system where you had that working triad of teacher, parent, and child. And then you bumped into the districts and then the states and now at the federal level. And don't think that the possibility isn't coming that international standards will begin to guide what goes on in our schools. That's already happening now at the UN. This push now to inculcate, to use the Trojan horse, whatever else Common Core is. It's a Trojan horse to feed all sorts of other, and it has to be, doesn't it? You've seen the national health care law work, right? Whatever else you want to say about the national health care, it's not really interested in improving the overall health care of the country. The purpose of Obamacare is not to elevate everybody's medical care. It's to equitize it. And if you're going to get more and more people enrolled, particularly people who aren't paying anything into it, if you're going to do more of that, you, by definition, have to lower the overall quality. And that's social justice, right? Let's lower the standards so that everybody has minimal coverage and no one's allowed to supersede it. That's the, and they named Obamacare the Affordable Care Act, as if anybody actually believed it was more affordable. It's not. But they called it that. Common Core may be the first time in the history of big government takeovers where they actually named a program what it is. And I think they regret it. I think if they had to do it over again, they would not have called it Common Core. In fact, I don't know if you've noticed this, but at local school boards, go to your school boards, go talk to your teachers. They are no longer even talking about Common Core. They won't mention it. They pretend it's not there. They talk about standards obliquely. And you're all shaking your heads, moms. You've had this experience, have you? I think if they had to do it over again, they wouldn't call it Common Core. They'd call it something like happy, happy, joy, joy education. Because you couldn't possibly be against joy, could you? Right? You couldn't be against affordability. And so the fact that it's so dishonest, right? The purpose of Common Core is not to allow our kids, your kids aren't common. Your kids are not the same kid. The idea that we're going to educate with the sole purpose of making all your kids the same kid. The cookie cutter approach, right? Well, you know what? I got one kid who's really good in math and another kid who's really good in reading. Why should they get the same education? Why should the kid that can do math really well, other than basic literacy, why should we hold that kid back? because other kids in class are going to get a trauma if he moves forward, right? It doesn't make any sense. Our kids aren't that way, and this is one of the problems, and I'm going to use the word for the first time here, common. This is another way of saying we're socializing medicine, we're socializing education, right? The idea that because some kids are innately more gifted than others, the idea that some kids have better family backgrounds and more support than others, and the idea is that some kids are more disciplined and try harder than others. That's all not fair anymore. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create an educational system that requires every kid to create minimum basic competencies. With things like Common Core, it is as dangerous for kids to supersede the standards, in fact, more dangerous for kids to supersede the standards than it is for them to fall short. Because when kids fall short of the common standards, it's the easiest thing in the world to lower the standard. All right? And that's what happened over No Child Left Behind. Whatever standard it started with, continually the bar got lowered because more kids couldn't reach the standard. And what happens? You can't raise a standard under Common Core because the minute you do, more kids fall off. And so why have we lost more gifted and talented education programs, more honors programs in the last 2 years than in the previous 40, 50 years combined? Because under the new education regime, you will not be able to move ahead if you can. Same thing's happening in medicine, right? And I make these two comparisons because they're very similar, right? National health care and common education. There's a link here. We have a situation now in states like my state of Wisconsin where they're trying to pass a law to prohibit people from paying doctors in cash. That law looks like it's going to pass. You can no longer pay doctors with cash. Why? Because people who have money are actually asking doctors, and doctors are going off the grid. You can go directly to a doctor in Wisconsin, and most states now. You can go directly to a doctor and off the grid say, hey, I'm not going to use insurance. How much will you charge me for this exam or that operation? And because of all the bureaucratic red tape and all the nonsense that goes along with the regulation, the doctor can give you the direct treatment or the direct prescription or the direct interview much cheaper. And of course, now that has to be stopped because it's not common anymore, right? So Wisconsin, a state with a Republican assembly, a Republican Senate, and putatively one of the most conservative governors in the country, Scott Walker, is about to pass a law that will prohibit the private paying for health care with cash because that's not fair. What about people who can't pay with cash? Right? So we got to destroy that system. And here you are with Common Core, and that's the common in Common Core. We can't let kids jump ahead. We can't let kids exceed the standards because it pulls up everything. We can't have that, and it's not socially just. I want to sort of leave you with this. The principle of Common Core. It was never intended to make your kids better readers, better writers, better mathematicians, or better scientists. It was never the intention of Common Core. The intention of Common Core was to social engineer education so that it seemed to progressive thinkers more fair. It's not fair. When I was in 3rd grade, I had a high school reading level. And in my public school, I was allowed to read high school books. None of my other classmates was traumatized by that. I did no harm. But it was can you imagine what my life would have been like in 3rd grade if for the next 8 years I had to read 4th and 5th and 6th grade books like everybody else? What would have happened to the one thing, and trust me when I tell you this, what would have happened to the one and only skill that I had? And now you think about what that means for math kids. If you're in a 3rd grade math class, see, when I was in 3rd grade math, I was doing 2nd grade math. Right? And quite frankly, that's about all I can do now. I mean, I can balance a checkbook, I can leave a tip, although I always leave 20%, seriously, because I can't figure out 15. But you know what? The world needs more than CPAs. God, I hope you believe that. The world needs more than CPAs. The world needs more than people common. We need people with their God-given independent talents to be able to pursue those talents. We need an educational system that's going to allow me to jump ahead in reading, even if I am a little behind in math. And that's what goes away with Common Core. That's the common in it, right? Well, we know, as Margaret Thatcher said, right? Socialism ultimately is shared misery, right? It's a fairer system, according to the federal government, if we all suffer with less health care in the name of inclusiveness. It's a fair system, the federal government's now saying, if we all suffer with less education, if that means everybody can say they have the same education. That's not the spirit in which this country was built. That's not why people come from those socialist countries, risk their lives to come here. You know, the people who come here from foreign countries, most of them socialist countries, right? They come here because they know they're going to start at the rock bottom. And they also know that if they work hard, their kids can be president. That's what they know. How is that possible under a common education? You know, I've given talks in 40 states now, over 400 of them. Just last night we had a man from Egypt who came up to me and he said, and I've heard from people from Cuba, from South America, from Poland, Lithuania, Eastern Europe, and they all say the same thing. We came to your country, and we knew we could fail. And thank God we also knew we could get ahead. This big government nanny do-gooder nonsense, this argument that social justice trumps freedom. You know what? With this attitude that the left has, and Mr. Tucker is a prime example of this, that the best way we help kids is take all risk away. All risk that they fail, all risk that, because when you pull everybody down to a very low level, nobody fails. We're going to take all risk away, but if you do that, if you create a system without risks, you create a system without rewards, and you create a system without incentives. This Common Core testing, this Common Core pedagogy, the Common Core standards themselves and the way they were implemented in your schools, and isn't it ironic that a program that is this socializing, this leveling, was put in by non-democratic means? No state legislature voted on it. They didn't ask the legislature of New Hampshire if they wanted it or not. It was taken at the highest levels, and now the legislators, have to deal with it. Moms and dads weren't asked. The Congress, the Senate of the United States weren't consulted on this. Nobody, parents, nobody, teachers at the New Hampshire level were not asked whether this was going to work or not. All of it was done. Let that be a lesson. Let that be my last comment to you. Look at the way the powers that be put it in. Without anybody's consent, without anybody's opinion, without consulting genuine educators. Bill Gates, no educational experience. David Coleman, architect of Common Core, no educational experience. Even a man like Mr. Tucker, no educational degree, not ever having worked in a public school, never having taught a class. These are the people who did this to you. What makes you think, if they did it that way, that their socialist approach to education is going to be anything more than one-sided fascism and tyranny when it's all boiled down? I'm so grateful to be here today. Thank you, New Hampshire. Keep fighting this, please.
We want to thank the state legislators that are here as well, and if there's any questions.
Yeah, we have time if anyone wants to ask
happy to
any
entertain
comments.
some.
Or... Yes, sir.
There was a child in our school district that started kindergarten, now in the 6th grade. Last year, he was in the 5th grade. I asked the school board why the 5th grade students still reading the 1st grade level. The answer was, we'll take care of it. This year he's in the 6th grade, and he still reads 6th grade level. When he graduates, he will not even be able to fill out an application for a job or read.
That's right. You know, and this is true across the board with Common Core. There was a recent Gallup survey done that demonstrated that the average college reading level, average freshman in college, read at about a 7th grade level. And think about that, middle school. And as a university professor, I see this for 22 years. These kids are showing up, and they do not read at the freshman and high school level. I'm trying to teach complicated works of literature that will enrich them and give them a cultural heritage, and I have to start by teaching them how to read. They literally cannot read. And so what's happening here, and what's been going on ever since we started this maddening testing regime, is you're socially promoting kids. You're putting kids, and you hear this all, I've heard this from Common Core teachers. There's no point in failing kids because they're not going to get anything more at the next level anyway. There's no point holding these kids back artificially because they're not going to get, and you move them forward, they're going to be in exactly the same place as if you make them take it again. And you're not going to do anything about this because the system is not designed to do that. So you look at the textbooks, you look at we're already pitching education to kids way below the level. Jason Zimba, the architect of Common Core Math, is on film. I showed it in my talk last night. He's on film admitting that his Common Core math standards were not designed to prepare your kids for STEM careers, you know, the unimportant things like science, technology, engineering, and math. That it was never designed to prepare your kids for STEM careers or even for college math at a selective four-year college. They're starting from the premise that we're going to lower your kids' standards. We're not trying to make your kids college or career ready. When Mr. Tucker talks about countries like Singapore and China and how they're doing things so much better, and maybe we could learn from them. Well, think about what China is. China's an elite communist nation where less than 1% of people get an actual education. Right? The idea that we're going to be China only allows gifted elites to go to school. So we will compare our kids to their kids. And their kids are the elite. Their kids have been trained. Their kids get extra special attention because there's so few of them relatively who are going to school, and they're all being groomed to fit the Communist Party mentality. A place like Singapore, a very, very tiny completely ethnically homogeneous country, right? With very low divorce rates, no socioeconomic upheaval, and for all intents and purposes, a statist Marxist economy. That's our model? You know the irony of all this international benchmark garbage? Every single country we compare America to has one thing in common, because they all do it differently. But the one thing all these countries have in common, they're all highly centralized, highly state-controlled educational systems. That's what appeals to people like Mr. Tucker. That's what he wants. He has no intention, any more than Obamacare is intended to improve everybody's medical care. He has no intention whatsoever of improving education for kids, only controlling it, manipulating it, using it to collect data to control populations, to condition the will of the people. That's why nobody's bothered by the complete level of remediation. Roger Scruton, the great British philosopher, made the following observation. 100 years ago, we taught Greek and Latin in high school. Today, we teach remedial English in college. Can't get around the truth of that observation. And what's happened in the last 100 years? Well, for instance, the huge uptake, the compulsive public school education model we now have was put in place. There's a reason the Founding Fathers made no provision for public education, because they knew the minute you put the federal government in charge of educating kids primarily, they would educate for their benefit, not for the benefit of families and local communities. I'm surprised it took this long to get this bad, honestly, once we set that system up.
You know that 80% of China's billionaires live in Singapore.
Right, 80%. Yep, 80% of Chinese billionaires live in Singapore.
Like our 1%.
Right? Like our 1%, absolutely. And take the English model, for instance, or the European. We always hear how the Europeans educate better than us, but they're also elitist snobs. In European schools, by the time you hit 5th grade, you've been winnowed off the college track. Right? They've tested and tested and tested you. They've tried to gauge your abilities. And in Europe, you're already, by the time you reach 5th, 7th, and 8th grade, you're already done. 60% of the student body is already eliminated from college. It's not like you have over here. And let me ask you that too. Why do we have this increasing push for free college tuition, for mandatory college? What is it doing? At my university and the University of Wisconsin system is a good system. 4 out of 10 of my kids every year, 40% of my kids don't belong in school. Either intellectually they cannot do the work, or attitudinally they won't. That's 4 out of 10 kids. But that's 4 out of 10 kids saddled with 2 and 3 and 4 years of student loan debt for degrees that they'll never be able to do anything with. Why was President Obama's first act as president to federalize the student loan program? Why? To make sure that kids who were going to spend $100,000 to study creative writing for 4 years, or women's studies, right? We're going to get as much money to go to college as kids who are going to be engineers and biologists. And now we have a situation where the American student loan debt for our kids is over $1 trillion. The student loan debt for our kids is more than the collective credit card debt of the country. Now you got candidates, which is probably why they're going to win. Candidates like Bernie Sanders and now Hillary Clinton's picked it up, right? We're going to waive the student loan debt. We're going to give college away for free. And let me ask you, given what you see happening to the public schools, and given what you see happening to our health care, when college is free, do you think the standards at college will go up or down? Right? Economics is a cruel mistress. She never lies to you. That's why our progressives are so contemptuous of history, because history gives us lesson after lesson after lesson how none of this works. That's why the first thing David Coleman did when he left Common Core and became the president of the college boards, right, where he's in charge of the SATs, ACTs now, rewriting the standardized tests, first thing he did was rewrite the history standards. The APUSH, the Advanced Placement U.S. History Standards, completely revisioned American history to make it seem like capitalism is wicked. America is not a free country. We're nothing but a bunch of racist, sexist, bigot, homophobes. Those are the narratives your kids learn. And if we're growing up generations of kids, and that's what Common Core is doing to them, we're growing up generations of kids who are convinced that this country is wicked and unfair and don't understand the other side of the story, well, that's why the demographics keep skewing the way they do. If Obama had not won as definitively the 18 to 30 age group in the last election, he lost in every other demographic. Even African-American votes were down for Obama in 2012. If he had had just 10% fewer of the 18 to 30s, he'd have lost the election. But that generation is the college-age generation. That's the generation that's gone through these schools. What do you think your grandkids, how do you think your grandkids are going to view your country with things like Common Core? Right? And that's how come it becomes so easy to change it. Yes, sir.
Are you speaking tonight in Massachusetts?
We are speaking tonight. Give us how's organized that? Where
Yes,
are
he'll be speaking at the Endicott Estate in Dedham, which is off of exit 14 off of 128, 7 p.m., free admission. And it's about an hour, a little more than an hour from here, an hour and 10 minutes. And tomorrow's a holiday. Hopefully some of you can come down. He gives a nice full-blown presentation.
Yeah, and my talk, the other nice thing about the talk, if you can attend, is that here I don't have the ability to do it. I don't like saying things like some other people who get invited to the State House. I don't like saying things without being able to prove them. So in the talk I give, every slide is documented. Every slide is, all the information is listed where I got it from, and I will make my slides available to you. You can have them free of charge, because you should verify me, right? And when you do and find out I'm not lying to you, all right, then you'll see why we've got this problem and what we can do to fight it. Thank you, everybody. It was great to be here today.
Thank you.